Welcome to Infection and Immunity Evidence Explained, a Doherty Institute podcast. I'm Rebecca Elliott, and Happy New Year to all of our listeners. For those of you still on a summer break or winter, if you're listening in the Northern Hemisphere and looking for your next great read, then look no further than Life as We Knew It. Captivatingly written by the Age newspaper journalists Aisha Dow and Melissa Cunningham, this book tells the gripping inside account of Australia's extraordinary pandemic story. It has been described by our very own Peter Doherty as a terrific account of Australia's outstanding political and public health response to COVID-19. He says we all lived through it, and it's our story. Today, I'm very pleased to be joined by the authors. Aisha and Melissa are both multi-award-winning journalists. Aisha is health editor at The Age, and Melissa is a city reporter for The Age.
Aisha and Melissa, thanks so much for joining me on Infection and Immunity Evidence Explained.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you,
Beck.
Yeah.
All right, let's start with you, Aisha. Do you recall when you first heard about the mysterious pneumonia in China?
Yeah, I was on maternity leave. I just had twin boys and I was feeling a bit anxious about coming back into work after a year at home. And I guess I was hoping that I'd be able to sort of ease my way into work after a year away. And obviously the idea of a pandemic on the horizon wasn't all that appealing. So I can't remember exactly when I first heard about COVID, but I know I wasn't kind of overly thrilled at the prospect.
Well, it was just so frightening at the time. We didn't really know what was upon us. What about you, Mel?
So at the end of 2019 and 2020, I was covering the bushfires in East Gippsland. And I remember sort of reading a little bit about COVID in international media. But the first time I realised that it was going to be a big deal was a Saturday afternoon in late January, and there was a big press conference with Greg Hunt and Scott Morrison. There had been a Chinese national visiting Melbourne who had become Australia's first confirmed case of COVID, and they were being treated at the Monash Medical Centre. And I remember in that press conference, Greg Hunt was talking about this term contact tracing, and we put it in inverted commas in the story and not realising when we had to look up, what's contact tracing? What does that mean? And we didn't know at that time that it would become part of our vocabulary for the years following, really.
Yeah. So you both reported on the pandemic throughout its course, including 6 lockdowns here. What was it like for you?
So I was on maternity leave, obviously, before the pandemic. And actually that was quite isolating, and I was quite prepared for the pandemic before it hit because of that. And I remember this day when I was walking the streets around my home in Melbourne, and I went down a street that I don't normally go down. And I was sort of in a daze. And when I came to, I had a few seconds where I didn't know where I was or what time it was. Like, I didn't know if it was morning or afternoon. Yeah. And it was because I was so used to walking the same streets and seeing the same things that my brain was like, what am I doing? And I think that kind of carried on into the pandemic, that you almost felt like you were living in a movie set or something. It was a bit Truman Show, how small our world became. Yeah, I guess I had young children. They were 1, 2, and 3. They were growing older during the pandemic, and there was still a lot of joy in our life. But yeah, it definitely felt like a bit of the colour of the world had been taken away.
But you guys were considered an essential worker, so were your kids in daycare? Or?
Yeah, I was. So I was able to send my kids to childcare the whole time, which was really handy. So I guess in terms of our work days, I'd drop them off at kindy, and then we'd spend the whole day kind of working flat chat until 6 or 7 at night. We'd often be writing what we called the COVID trunk, which is basically like the front page, again, journalistic word, splash. So the state political reporters would be out at the press conferences talking to Brett Sutton and Dan Andrews. And then Mel and me, when I was working, we'd be kind of hitting the phone, speaking to epidemiologists and trying to get like a couple of steps ahead of where we were with the COVID situation to explain to people what might happen next.
And what about you, Mel?
Oh, it was full on. I think it was a really strange thing covering a story that you were living in.
Absolutely.
And that doesn't really happen often. And I think for me, I guess work was a bit of a lifeline because there was so much happening at the time on the health round. And so we had those, obviously, as everyone in Melbourne would remember, those mammoth press conferences. Mm-hmm. And I remember family and friends trying to call me and say, are we going back into lockdown? Yeah. Like trying to get the scoop before it was happening. But I do remember there's sort of, I have kind of memories back from that time of the first lockdown. And I remember going into the Austin Hospital in Melbourne, and they had the first sort of COVID ward set up there, and going there and visiting the hospital and seeing there was only a couple of people that were in the ICU there. And that was really confronting. And I just remember thinking, well, this is going to be huge. And then getting home from that visit, they said, take your clothes off and wash them in hot water and all that sort of strange thing that you heard about doctors and nurses and healthcare workers doing.
Before PPE?
Well, no, we had PPE, but
yeah.
It was sort of like there was so much unknowns about how it was spreading. And so there was like this real fear of, and I remember interviewing nurses at the time that were saying they get home and they a hot bucket of soapy water waiting to just put their clothes, and they'd have a shower before they even go and see their family. So there was kind of like an unknown about how it was spreading. And so I remember that being quite a surreal experience. And then obviously we had so many lockdowns following then, and the novelty sort of wore off of working from home and all that sort of thing. And then there was the contrast of when we had the Delta wave and we were in another massive lockdown, and there was obviously protests on the streets, and the COVID wards were a completely different thing. And then going back and seeing the COVID ward this time at Sunshine Hospital, Western Health, and how different that was and how many people were infected with the virus. And yeah, when you look back, it was just extraordinary, really. And it's hard to sort of process how much happened in that time.
Yeah. I just want to touch on the part where you said work was a bit of a lifeline. Do you think that sort of being in the know sort of helped you move through it and giving you sort of like, I guess, a false sense of control?
I think it was just staying busy for me. When we went into lockdown, for some people, not all, but for some people, life slowed down. We didn't have the experience of having time to bake the sourdough loaves or things like that. It was just absolutely crazy. We didn't really have time to sit down and think and feel sorry for ourselves. So I guess for me, that was a bit of a distraction. And also because we were spending a lot of time speaking to experts, we were probably, or I felt I was more kind of grounded in the why we were doing this. So like for me personally, couldn't see my parents. They're in Adelaide. Couldn't see my brother. He's overseas. It wasn't clear when I would be able to see them. But when you're speaking to epidemiologists every day, I guess, you have a sense of why we were making the sacrifices we were making.
I think that sort of idea of a lifeline, it was keeping busy, as Aish said. But also I felt like that there was this huge sense of responsibility at that time, that it was like this big story and that it sort of really mattered to people that we stick to the facts and the science, didn't alarm people who are already sort of on edge because of uncertainty. And it felt like in a weird way that we're kind of writing this draft of this big moment in history. So I feel like that sense of purpose was helpful in kind of keeping you grounded and going. But that's not to say that like we didn't go mad during the lockdown.
I think everyone went a little bit mad at some point. That's the perfect segue, not going mad, but talking about writing about something, a huge moment in history. You wrote this wonderful book, Life as We Knew It, which I absolutely loved. So how did the book actually come about?
Yeah, so I think we had it in mind for about 6 months or so before we approached our publisher, who was actually immediately keen on the idea. I think by the time we pitched it, there was already a sense of wanting to people wanting to move on and move forward. But definitely for me, it just felt like we'd been through such a monumental event. Obviously, in my lifetime, it's the most disruptive event that I've lived through. The idea that we would not be able to go 5 kilometres from home, that we would not be able to take our kids to the playground. It's the sort of stuff that's sort of out of science fiction, really.
Yeah, absolutely.
And then on top of that, I kind of felt like there were stories that had been kind of not told or underappreciated. So I think we were both keen to go outside Victoria and New South Wales, where they had challenges and hardships, but they were very different to here in Melbourne. Yeah, and I guess to this day, it's the only book that's really been attempted on, that comes from the perspectives of the many Australians that we interviewed, that looks at the kind of national experience of the pandemic.
Yeah, and we'll get to some of those stories shortly. So who was it that came up with the idea and said to the other, right, let's do this?
It was Aisha, and we were probably madly on deadline that day. And I'd gone to her house because we were still working from home. And we'd gone and got lunch, and we were sitting in a park in Footscray or something, I think. And she said she'd been thinking about the idea and asked me if I was interested. And I said yes. But I think now I look back, I'm like, we were so naive, not knowing like what we were taking on. And it just kind of got bigger and bigger. And it's funny too, because I think we've told this to sort of our family and friends, and we laugh about it. And it's probably what we do in our stories too, is it was meant to be a 60,000 word book. Mm-hmm. And by the end, it was like more than 100,000 words.
Wow.
With double the amount of chapters or whatever that we'd initially pitched.
Yeah. So you interviewed the Prime Minister at the time, Scott Morrison, and 6 premiers across the country. What was this experience like? We'll start with you, Aisha.
Yeah, so I think there was definitely an element of wanting to kind of shore up their own legacy. And as Mel was saying, kind of going into it, we didn't have any idea how many people would say yes to us. Obviously, our pitch to the publisher was that we wanted to speak to these politicians about what it was like to lock down a state or a country. But we had no idea if we'd get none or all of them. So we were really pleasantly surprised with how many people had agreed to interviews. We were particularly surprised at Scott Morrison, because the last pandemic book that he was involved in, called Plague, and that's by 2 journalists at The Australian, had backfired on him because that had revealed the secret ministry scandal. Mm-hmm. But he did say yes. But when we spoke to him, he'd come back. He was no longer Prime Minister. He'd just come back from summer holiday, his first real break, he said, for a while. And he was really relaxed, and we kind of felt like we could almost ask him anything. So we were kind of able to push him on some questions like his relationship with the premiers and things like that.
And perhaps what did he say about that?
Yeah, so he had some interesting things to say. I mean, I think he got along quite well with Mark McGowan, which was interesting because they're both from opposite sides of the political spectrum. And Mark had some really funny stories to tell when we interviewed him for the book about Scott Morrison calling him when he's cooking a curry in the night, and they were arguing about the Palmer issue and the border controls, and Mark McGowan refusing to sort of open up the borders until they got a certain number of people vaccinated. So I do think that he was quite positive about the premiers, but then it was interesting travelling to Queensland and speaking to Anastasia Palaszczuk, and she had quite a challenging relationship with the New South Wales government and with Scott Morrison as well, due to her quite hardline approach. So during that interview, she accused Scott Morrison of running a boys' club and excluding female premiers from big discussions around how Australia was responding. So it was interesting to get her perspective and also get Scott Morrison's perspective and see how they sort of differed.
Yeah, absolutely. So were there any particularly stories that did surprise you when you spoke to, say, the Prime Minister, the premiers, or the chief health officers?
One of the things that maybe we didn't expect from Morrison is he made some concessions around his previous stance on border closures. So as you probably can remember, he was quite anti-domestic border closures during the pandemic. And one of the things that he said was, at least in the case of WA, which he rallied against at the time, that he could understand how that made sense in retrospect. And that was actually something that came out quite strongly in the book, although we've got sections that really talk about the terrible impacts of border closures. But there was a sense that they worked for those smaller states in keeping the virus out, and that perhaps if we were to have another pandemic again, or when we have another pandemic again, they'll probably take the same step again as they did in the Spanish flu.
Yeah. You tell the stories so beautifully of so many other names and voices we heard throughout the pandemic. Who were some of the people and the stories that particularly stood out to you both? We'll start with you, Mel.
Yeah, I think for every chapter that I wrote, there were people that stood out. And I think because we made an effort at the start of the book to really concentrate on the humanity of the people we interviewed, and also the people that did extraordinary things during a really difficult time. They could have been politicians or public officials, but also ordinary Australians. So some of my favourite ones, I think, well, there was a funeral director, Andrew Pinder, who I interviewed for the aged care chapter and some of the Victorian chapters. And he talked about what it was like for him working through the aged care crisis when there was COVID outbreaks everywhere and attending those homes in the northern suburbs and taking away the bodies of the dead and picking up people that had died and been taken to, there was this temporary morgue outside of the Royal Melbourne Hospital, which we didn't even really know about. But just the compassion and empathy that he had for those people that had died and for their families. Because at that time too, there was a lot of fear around how the virus was spread. There were a lot of funeral directors like him that were too afraid to go into those homes and take those bodies away because they were scared that they were going to get the virus. So he was one of the few in Melbourne that continued to do that and continued to hold funeral services. And so it was just a really extraordinary insight that I don't think we really heard from before.
Yeah, I was going to say, we don't really hear about that job very much.
And how much it changed for people during that time. And he did say something that really stuck with me, which was like, never seen magnitude of death like that other than the Black Saturday bushfires. Such a high volume of people dying in a short period. And you had a colleague who was a funeral director as well, whose own family member was inside one of the aged care homes, and this man would go there every day and have a vigil outside the aged care home. So I think those people, and there were other people too, like Ines Rio, who helped, a GP from Melbourne who helped lead the response at the public housing towers, just an amazing person who got a phone call from someone she knew that was down there and just without sort of any direction from the government or anything, just went down there and helped get medication to people that were in lockdown in their homes. And of course, Jamal Riffy, who was a New South Wales GP as well, he basically was meant to retire and go around Australia in a camper van with his wife, but he instead erected a tent out front of his house and started a testing clinic and really tried to help with the Middle Eastern community, which he was a part of, to get them vaccinated, to get the information out about COVID. Yeah. Just another incredible person who really just went above and beyond to help people.
Made a real difference.
Yeah.
And what about you, Aisha?
I guess some of my favourite parts of the book were looking at places and events that I hadn't known a lot about during the pandemic. So kind of later in the book writing process, after we realised that we were going to get a lot of the premieres, we realised that we hadn't got to Tasmania yet. So I got in touch with Peter Gutwin and organised to interview him. I flew down to Launceston, and I also interviewed the equivalent to their chief health officer and the department health secretary. I just found it really fascinating because I'd only loosely heard about the Burnie outbreak, which happened in April 2020 and affected their hospital. I really couldn't remember a lot about it. And I was having an interview with the secretary of the health department, and she was telling me about how terrible and impactful this outbreak had been and how it had really influenced Tasmania's approach to the pandemic and managing COVID. She said that there were so many people furloughed or so many staff sick at the hospital that when she called the general manager, I think kind of to get an update, the general manager was working at the morgue. They were so understaffed. And she was talking about the experience of having to shut down the emergency department, which was meant to kind of cover like a huge section of Tasmania. They ended up getting the army to come in and get that service running. But, you know, how do you close an emergency department? There were no locks on the door because the emergency department is meant to be open for 24/7. Yeah, so I really enjoyed that. And there were definitely many other instances researching the book where you kind of thought, oh, no, how did I not know about this? Yeah. And actually one of the most heartening pieces of feedback we've got from the book is people that did work at a very high level in government managing the response to the pandemic who said that they learned some things from the book too.
Yeah, absolutely. And as I said before, as a Victorian, learning so much about what the other states went through because we really were in a Victorian bubble here. So it was great to read. There are so many different stories that could have been told, were told, but how did you decide what to tell?
It was so hard. We started with a loose outline, which we actually did follow quite well. So we had a draft of chapter ideas that we sent to our publisher and we did most of them. So just added a lot more. Yeah. But yeah, I think even after 100 or whatever 1,000 words it was, there's always going to be things that we still could have done. I guess we wanted to touch on a bit of everything. Like we tried to get to someone that had been locked out of Australia because of the border closures. Yeah, still there are things that I'd have liked to have done more on.
And I think also having a mix of voices too, having those people that were in those high up decision-making jobs and the toll that it took on them and the pressure of making those decisions, but also people that were, everyone in Australia, in the world really, has a story to tell about their own experience. So making sure we had that balance of officials and politicians and ordinary Australians and what they sort of went through at that time too. So balancing that, and then the light and shade as well, because it was a really heavy, difficult time, but having some of those lighter stories alongside some of those more sad and devastating stories about what people went through.
Yeah, and we'll definitely get to those a little bit further on. So you also tell the stories of the voices that we didn't hear a lot about and that were essentially demonized through some of the media. One of those names was Michael Podgorski. Who is Michael Podgorski, Aisha?
Yeah, so you may not recognise that name, but you probably do know the phrase Bondi limo driver. So this was an unvaccinated chauffeur who caught the Delta strain of COVID from FedEx crew that had arrived from overseas in June 2021. I always imagined as a limo driver that he would be driving one of those kind of stretched limos. Yeah. That's what I imagined. But actually it's just a ordinary sedan. And Michael's a sole trader, so he wasn't working for any big company. He was working for himself, which meant, of course, when he got sick from COVID, that he didn't have any income coming through. So as a result of Michael's infection, as you probably remember, COVID got out into Sydney and then back into Melbourne and then into the ACT, and that was the end of COVID zero in Australia. Many hundreds of people also died in that Delta wave. But yeah, as I think you were saying, that Michael was really demonized by sections of the media and by politicians as sort of the reason, the person to blame for that outbreak.
Yeah, and just given the name, the limo driver kind of says it all.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It was quite difficult to get an interview with him and his wife. I guess unsurprisingly, they were still quite traumatized by what happened to them and I guess their treatment at the hands of some of the media. And they initially said no, but I was traveling to Sydney and I asked them again. I think maybe they'd forgotten who I was by then, and they said yes. But it was really eye-opening to hear their story. And I really went away from the interview feeling that they were quite vulnerable people.
Certainly when I got from reading about them.
So migrants, kind of English as a second language. Michael had wanted to get the Pfizer vaccine but hadn't been able to get it. He didn't want the AstraZeneca vaccine because, like many people at the time, he was worried about blood clots. And I think it's easy for people to say, I would have done differently, but there would have been plenty of Australians that would have made the same decisions as him at that time. As we later learned, there were no laws in New South Wales requiring him to be vaccinated, which is obviously a glaring weakness in the quarantine system. It was just an accident waiting to happen. Quite incredible, really, given the cost to the nation. Yeah, there was a police investigation into Michael's actions. He wasn't charged with anything in the end. Yeah, so I guess we saw throughout the pandemic that there were other people like Michael that ended up kind of being the objects of blame. And that was something that came through a lot in retrospect during our research when you were listening back or looking at transcripts from politicians' press conferences. So there were a couple of other instances in Victoria that stood out to me. So in June 2020, when it became apparent that there had been a breach of hotel quarantine in Victoria because of the amazing work of a scientist at the Doherty Institute, the Premier, Daniel Andrews, was very quick to kind of shift blame on the security guards, saying they'd broken well-known and well-understood infection control protocols. And he said that guards had spread COVID by sharing cigarette lighters. And then shortly after, when Melbourne went into its second big lockdown, the state's contact tracing system had basically collapsed. he said, I think each of us knows someone who has not been following the rules as well as they should have been. So I remember at that time there was kind of a lot of guilt that it was our fault, that we'd done something wrong, that we hadn't been following the rules. And here we were, an outlier going back into lockdown again.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, but in retrospect, I think you definitely say the big issues at play at that time were probably the fact that our public health team wasn't as resourced as it should have been. And at the start of the pandemic, we only had 14 contact tracers.
As a Melburnian, there were some parts of the book that I found quite hard to read. So namely the chapters that covered the lockdown of Melbourne's public housing, towers, and the horrific extent of the outbreaks in the aged care facilities, which we sort of touched on before. But what was it like for you, Mel, to delve into those stories?
Yeah. So when I wrote those chapters, it's interesting because at the time, everything there was one crisis after another in Melbourne. There was outbreak, Cedar Meads, and then there was public housing lockdowns, and you are reporting on that at the time, but it sort of washes over you. And I think going back and examining what happened there, it was really harrowing. And so with aged care, you could write a whole book on what went wrong there, really, and interview people. There were so many things. It was sort of a cascade of catastrophic failures, at the heart of which were issues that were decades in the making. And you could look at that confusion over whether it was state or federal government responsibility. You had essential workers that were working in really poor conditions across multiple aged care homes, trying to make a living, not being adequately protected from the virus. You had a regulator that failed to see what was unfolding until it was too late. And so it was quite confronting going back to that and looking at that and what went wrong. And I think some of the interviews that stood out for me was there was an aged care nurse, Mark Murray, who worked for Western Health, and he was going around to all the aged care homes in the western suburbs and beyond, really, to look after the people that had been infected with the virus. And he talked about the things that he saw and getting these phone calls late at night because there was no staff in the homes, and what he saw in those homes was just things that would never sort of leave him, and how there just wasn't enough staff to be with all the people that were dying or that were really sick. Another interview that really stood out to me was a Melbourne woman called Jane, and her father died in one of the northern suburbs aged care homes, Borough. And she had basically, when I interviewed her, I could just see how much she loved her dad, and she'd researched all these aged care homes in Melbourne and found the one that she thought would be the best place for him. And she used to go and visit him nearly every day, and then not being able to see him and just calling the aged care home over and over again to try and find out if he was okay. And she told this story about, it was the last time she had seen him, and she just went to the aged care home and he was in the window, like holding his hands against the glass, and she couldn't get to him, and they were both crying. And a couple of days later, he was dead. And the impact that that's had on her has just been so profound. And the other families that went through similar experiences to her, she has nightmares. She said she can't even hear Dan Andrews' voice on the radio or on TV, kind of has this really visceral response for her, emotional response. And I think really too, there was a big outbreak in Sydney aged care home that happened right at the start, where people died, and there was a really poor response initially to what was going on. And then it just happened all over again in Melbourne. So there was this, how could we have let it happen again? And I think with the public housing towers as well, that was another story that really, reporting on it at the time, was really intense and full on. But then going back and speaking to people that were caught up in that a year later or 18 months later and hearing about their experiences, you're just really like, wow, I can't believe that happened. And I think what stood out to me at that time was, I think that the authorities, they were trying to do the right thing, and they were trying to protect the people that were in public housing towers. What they didn't do is just allow them the human rights of being able to go to the supermarket, get some food, get their medication that was afforded to every other Australian when there was a lockdown. And just this kind of response where they were sort of basically locked inside their flats without the support that they needed, and how that sort of made them feel as well. So it was a really, confronting and chapters to write, but also just so important, I think, because there are some huge lessons from that we need to take on for the next pandemic or whatever is
whatever comes next.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting you touch on that because I remember reading about the public housing towers at the time and obviously the aged care, and you're really thinking to yourself at that time it's the right thing to do, or whether or not it is the right thing to do, this is what we have to do to get through this pandemic, this crisis. But then you go back and read it in hindsight and through your beautifully told book, and it's really quite confronting and, as I said earlier, and relatively unfathomable and really unbelievable that we all, as I said, went through that, and those are some of the experiences of the people and seeing their loved ones for the last time through a window. I can't even imagine that. So, yeah, thank you for telling those stories. So another common thread throughout the book, of course, was the border wars. For example, you described in great detail, and this is actually one of my favourite chapters, was the Great Wall of Coolangatta and the island within an island. Tell me more about the border wars.
Yeah, so that was a huge theme, I think, that continually emerged in our research of the book. And it was like this kind of alternative reality that in Victoria we had our own experience, but then in places like Western Australia, they lived relatively normal lives. The economy was ticking along. There were hardly any cases and hospitalizations. And so it was really fascinating to go back and look at what was their experience like and how did they kind of protect themselves from the virus. And I think with the interview where I spoke to Mark McGowan, it was sort of straight away from the start, he basically just said, you might remember the cruise ships with the people, and they were sort of sailing past Western Australia. And
because he wouldn't let them in.
No, exactly. So he got into a big stoush with the federal government over that because I think they were concerned that their hospitals weren't prepared, and there was this tension around, and in the end, they did treat the people that had been on these cruise ships. But I think for Mark McGowan, that was just like, well, we're going to close off the borders now. We're not going to let anybody in. We're just going to protect our own people. And for him, it worked because in terms of his popularity, it soared to, he was like the most popular pandemic leader in the world. So it paid off in that way. But of course, there were costs of that too, in terms of people were not being able to see their loved ones who were dying, missing out on things like weddings, just time that you'll never get back with the people you care about again. And I think as time moves on and knowledge develops, there really is that kind of, that rigidness of those rules and the lack of nuance that was around them has really came through as a big theme in the book. But we did also have some interesting, fascinating, like the Great Wall of Coolangatta and that kind of divide between New South Wales and Queensland and the people that were living on the border. And Aisha and I both interviewed people that it was just like the mayor was having prawns and cocktails with his family that was on the other side of the border. And there were babies that had been born that were being passed across to family members over the border. And there were people that were sneaking around so they could get to work.
Via boats.
Yes, yeah. But then there was also things that you look back and you're like, how did that happen? Initially, I think, and they did sort of iron these out, but there were issues with people being able to get urgent healthcare from Queensland or from New South Wales and being able to get across to those two states. So it was really fascinating because I think, again, we were in our own Victorian bubble focusing on what was happening in Melbourne, and then to go out to those states and even, go out and speak to Anastasia Palaszczuk as well about Queensland's experience. And she was quite adamant that irrespective of the costs of that they would do it all over again.
That's fascinating, isn't it? All right. Well, there were some lighter parts of the book. What were some of your more light-hearted highlights? I'll start with you, Aisha.
Yeah, so I really loved interviewing Professor Eddie Holmes, who I'm sure wouldn't be a stranger to most people listening. Obviously a world-leading authority on virus evolution, but he's also a really straight shooter if you ever had the chance to talk to him, and he's a really great storyteller. So he had a really front row seat to the pandemic. One of the things that he was involved in, or I guess helped lead, were some early discussions with Anthony Fauci and others about a possible lab leak. And in this incredible story, he actually visited the Wuhan seafood market that's suspected now to be the source of COVID in 2014, I think it was. And he stood there and I think he looked at the raccoon dogs and a cage of birds on top of them and just thought, like, this is the place that you're going to get virus spill from animals to humans. So, quite extraordinary.
Yeah.
So, he had so many amazing stories, but it was really interesting to hear from him about those early discussions about where COVID had originated from. This concern passed, but for a couple of days he was quite concerned about the prospect of a lab leak. And he was talking about his experience kind of working out that he needed to maybe speak to Australian spies or our spy agency and kind of working out how he'd get in touch with them. And he was sort of joking, like, they're not in the white pages. So he ended up speaking to Nick Warner, who at the time was the head of Australia's Office of National Intelligence. Yeah, Eddie just thought it was so bizarre. He's a scientist. He's not meant to be speaking to the head of our spy agency. And another favourite that Mel reminded me of when we were coming in is a story from Craig Dalton, who's a veteran public health official from New South Wales. And he has a fantastic story about how he was contact tracing. It was the start of the Delta wave in Sydney in 2021. And he was trying to get in touch with a restaurant that was a potential COVID exposure site, and he couldn't get through to them. Yeah. And then he worked out, like, well, how are they open? Like, how are they getting orders? And then he realized that they were getting orders through an online app. Yeah. So he ordered a burrito, and he's a vegetarian. So he made sure to get a tofu burrito. He didn't want any animals to be slaughtered in the process because he wasn't going to use the burrito, I don't think. Yeah. And he had a note on the order in special instructions. I think he sent me the screenshot. So I had the exact words, but like, hello, I'm Craig Dalton. You're a potential exposure site. Can you please get in touch with me? And then I think it was like head office that called back saying, why have you contacted us via a burrito order? And he had to explain that he couldn't get in touch with them. So yeah, that was just one of the examples of the extraordinary things that contact tracers did during the pandemic. And obviously I've already touched on the overwhelm that contact tracers sometimes experience, but in Victoria and New South Wales and other places, the things that they were doing that we never heard about were just extraordinary. Yeah.
What about you, Mel? What about some of your lighthearted moments?
I loved doing interviews. I suppose one example is Professor Alan Cheng, who was the Deputy Chief Health Officer for a while in Victoria. I loved hearing about people's lives behind those big decisions. And I remember him telling a story about how I think he had meetings with the Premier and the state officials every day, but then he made time to do like a Zoom chat with his daughter's school, and they were asking questions like, can lions get COVID? And I liked hearing about the human behind the big decision or the big issue that was happening at the time. And so I think for me, you could kind of find those examples in a lot of the interviews that you did of this really difficult situation, really difficult time, but the amazing things that people were doing to kind of keep going. And I think that for me was a lot of the lighter moments came from those kind of stories.
Yeah. I just want to touch on that because I found that with most of the chapters that you opened with a story, whether it was Greg Hunt walking his dog or just being able to really put yourself in the position of what the person was going through at the time, who were all living through the crisis and having to make big decisions in very ridiculous situations. One example was myself, where I was running a media conference on Zoom, wearing my Ugg boots and my activewear down below, and then a blazer up top. Jodie McBurnan, our head of epidemiology, on screen and running this. And it's one of those moments that you look back on and go, how did we do that?
Yeah, it was. Yeah. And I think, so those lighter moments I think were so critical for the book, because when you look back and you think about all the lessons that we could have learned from then, or who fell through the cracks, the migrants, the essential workers, the impacts on children. I think we really needed those lighter stories to be able to get people to keep reading. If it was all heaviness and sadness, then I don't know. I think everyone's still traumatized from the pandemic. Yeah. I'm not sure that people would want to pick up our book and read it. So it was that balance. Yeah.
Yeah. We wanted a complete picture because there's a lot of focus on failures and disasters, but there were also a lot of things that went right, and certainly people that did amazing things, and we felt their stories needed to be recorded.
Yeah. Well, you told them so beautifully. Thank you so much for this book. I can't recommend it highly enough. Aisha and Melissa, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thanks so much for having us.
Thanks so much, Beck.
And thanks to all of you for listening to Infection and Immunity Evidence Explained, a Doherty Institute podcast. To purchase a copy of the book, visit the publisher's website, scribepublications.com.au. That's scribepublications.com.au. We also have a signed copy of the book to give away to one lucky listener, kindly donated by the authors. All you have to do is suggest a topic for the podcast by emailing doherty-media@unimelb.edu.au. That's doherty-media@unimelb.edu.au, and you will go into the draw. If you've enjoyed our podcast, please rate and review on your favourite podcasting app and subscribe if you haven't already. The Doherty Institute is a joint venture between the University of Melbourne and the Royal Melbourne Hospital. See you next time.